It's a different day. My late father, used to tell me that if I remembered anything he said, he asked me to remember this. He said, civilization is a thin veneer. Civilization requires diligence and support and care to survive. On my way up here to give this sermonette from Brown County, I was listening to the press conference from Minnesota. It was horrifying. It was very sobering, all the carnage that's taking place. So it's a different day, but it's a day that we can look forward past for a new life. Andrew Roberts wrote a very interesting biography called Walking with Destiny. The biography, of course, is about Churchill. If you haven't read it, I invite you to consider it. It's one of the best I've ever read. And he records that in 1920, while revolution was raging in Russia, he wrote an editorial, a major editorial in a London newspaper. He compared the anarchy of the then Bolshevik Revolution to the gift of the Jews. I don't have the quote with me, unfortunately, but I will say, and I'll put this on Facebook so you can see it later, but Churchill noted the incomparable contribution of God's body of laws, which Churchill said the entirety of Western civilization was based upon, and which had built an entire world out of the wreckage of the Roman Empire. So I find it unusual, comforting, inspiring that today we're on the cusp of the day of Pentecost, which is also the day tomorrow that Jewish tradition holds was the giving of that law. More importantly, it was the time when the people of ancient Israel, who were outlaws prior to that, were given a personal choice to become essentially God's own special treasure, to become his people and be set apart, and to bring to the world an astonishing gift of law. The time that the ancient Israel lived in bears some remarkable parallels to what you and I are going through right now. During the Passover season, a number of weeks ago, our whole lives are turned upside down. We had the pandemic rush through. We were sheltered in place. We had, like the day of the Passover, to be inside for a while to protect ourselves from a deadly scourge. Same thing happened many thousands of years ago to the ancient Israelites. Their lives were completely overturned in a few short weeks with a violent interaction of Moses and Pharaoh. The Israelites didn't ask Moses to come and be their leader, but it was given to them, and their whole lives were turned completely upside down. They had intensified oppression. They had supernatural plagues, the scope of which transcend the capacity of the human language. They left Egypt in a hurry. There wasn't any planning involved. They didn't say, okay, next year, by the way, we got to get everything all set up. They plundered the Egyptians, and they took with them a number of things, and they went out of Egypt prepared for battle. But at the same time, perhaps we don't think about this, when they hurried out of that region, the Bible says nothing about them stopping at Target or REI for a few tents and some sleeping gear. They were headed out into the desert. And this was not a small group. It was 600,000 people, males only, but scholars estimate the actual number between 2 and 3 million people, at least 2.5 million people. That's 3 times the city of Indianapolis proper. So you can imagine the entire city of Indianapolis moving into the desert region. It was not a light thing. So these people had no experience in camping. They had no experience in how to herd cattle. They had no experience in how to take care of elderly people or young kids in the wilderness. It was a lot of stress. And then plus, now they had a kind of a natural life they'd settled into, that even they talk about how later on in the book of Exodus that it was, in some cases, they thought comparable to what they were doing out there. They had a very unusual pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke that was guiding them. And for the Israelites, that was the new normal. So within a few days of leaving, Moses, a man who didn't enjoy a great deal of confidence from them, he led them into a trap. They're saying, what are we doing? We got the army of Pharaoh behind us. What is this guy? And what in the world is he telling us to do? You know the story. God delivered them. God performed a mighty miracle. He started changing and creating a culture among people who had no knowledge or very little knowledge of the way of God. When they crossed through, the large group of people was so huge that if you do the math, you'll see that the Red Sea had to part at least a mile wide in order for 2.5 million people to get across in a time allotted. But other challenges awaited them. During the time between Passover and the Feast of Weeks, they had supply chain issues with water, food, and other issues. They got attacked by a vicious and evil group of people known as the Amalekites, who were known for going after older people and people like mothers with children. It was no picnic for the Israelites during that time. Their new normal was not something they might have wanted. It was in a blazing desert. Hot days, wandering around, no clear path. So after a number of weeks, they end up in a mountain range. They camp near a particularly high mountain. Moses, their controversial leader, disappears. He is said to have gone up the mountain, and everybody's wondering what is going on. So then, for the Israelites, it got up front and personal. It was a special day coming up, the first time ever to observe the Feast of Weeks on this day of the giving of the law. So let me read you a little bit about that, a review. You know the story, but let's just hit some highlights in Exodus 19, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Let's pick it up in verse 2. Exodus 19, beginning in verse 2. They came to the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses climbs the mountain to appear before God. God personally instructs him and says, I want you to give the people these instructions. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. He's building a culture and a new way of life. It's a new normal. It's nothing like what they've had in the past. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, God says, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples on earth, for all the earth belongs to me. So, as we go on, read on, Moses comes back down and he tells the people. And how do they respond? Well, they buy into it. They say, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. So Moses goes back up the mountain again, and then God says to him, I will come to you in a thick cloud, Moses, so the people themselves can hear me when I speak with you. Then they will always trust you. So that's an important point in this, because God is part of this culture. At the very beginning, he expects his people to trust him, even when they don't fully understand. So then the instructions go on, as you can see in there. They had 3 days of preparation. It talks about how they had to wash their clothes. And everybody goes, well, what's a big deal about that? Well, if you've ever been out camping in the wilderness, particularly in the desert, it is a big deal. When there's no water to wash your clothes, it's a major deal. But God wanted them to think about it and get focused on what was going to come. He said, get ready and purify yourselves. So then, verse 16, things get pretty interesting. On the morning of the third day, thunder roared, and lightning flashed, and a dense cloud came down on the mountain. There was a long, loud blast, and all the people trembled. Moses led them out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Nobody wanted to be there. They were like, what in the world is going on? There were earthquakes, there were flashes of supernatural lightning, and as it says, all of Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord had descended on it in a form of fire. The smoke billowed into the sky like smoke from a brick kiln, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, 120, 130, 140 decibels, it hurt to listen to it. Moses spoke, and God thundered his reply. So the God came down on the top of the mountain and then called Moses to come back up. And then as we go on into the next chapter, God himself speaks to the Israelites and delivers the 10 Commandments. The point? This was not a pleasant experience. In the book of Hebrews, we read in chapter 12, verse 21, indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses himself said, I tremble with fear. This was a singularly unusual time, like what we're going through today. Not quite maybe as we don't have a mountain, because like as some Jewish commentators note, that piece of work that I just described, was the intersection of the supernatural and the temporal. The temporal, the mountain and the surrounding atmosphere, reacted violently. The Hebrew word for thunder can be translated voices. And some have said and written that the people heard God talking in a supernatural experience. Some Jewish traditions claim that God spoke in 70 languages when he delivered the Ten Commandments, which has obviously an interesting parallel to Acts 2. It was so intense in that experience that people begged it to stop. After God's voice thundered the Ten Commandments, we continue on in Exodus 20:18, verse 19. It said, when the people heard the thunder and the loud blast of the ram's horn, when they saw the flashes of lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, they stood at a distance, trembling with fear. And they said to Moses, make it stop. You speak to us and we will listen. But don't let God speak directly to us or we will die. It was a tough experience. In modern terms, this is similar to what produces post-traumatic stress syndrome, or PTSD. Here's what the Mayo Clinic says about PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition that is triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts. Most people, the good news is, who go through traumatic events may have temporary difficulty adjusting and coping, but with time, they usually get better. So that first part sounds a little bit like what we're going through, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like today, especially with what's going on in Minnesota and other parts of the United States. It's a dumpster fire in some respects. Let's get personal here for a second. When's the last time you actually trembled with fear? I can think of 3 times. The first one was on October 1st, 1987 at 7:42 a.m. when a Whittier earthquake hit Pasadena and the surrounding part of Los Angeles. I was in a car driving to work on a college campus, and I watched the actual road on the 210 indunulate, and that was terrifying. It just went on for 20 long seconds, which doesn't seem like a long time, but when you're in the middle of an earthquake, that's a lifetime. I couldn't take my hands off the wheel because my hands were trembling. Second occurred a few years later. I'd taken a position on the business faculty at Pepperdine University. It was hard to get to because especially during the mudslide season. So I started going out to 210, and those of you know California, and driving down the Dahunga Pass, Canyon Road. So I went down there, and one day I had 8 o'clock class, and I had a little RX-7 they used to call the urban assault vehicle when it got muddy. And so I was driving around. It was fun. I had a 4-speed stick car, and it was a sports car. So I was zooming along, trying to get this class on time, and all of a sudden the engine started acting up. I thought, what in the world? So I slowed down to kind of nurse it. I came around a blind curb, and there was a boulder that took up the entire road. And if I'd come around at my normal speed, I would have run right into it. And as soon as I realized that, it was like my mind just went blank. I barely got around. And again, I couldn't take my hands off the wheel because it was trembling. The third time, which relates to today and the situation we're going to, is during the Rodney King riots out in Los Angeles. The first day was awful. The second day they called out the National Guard. And the third day they called the U.S. Army. When the U.S. Army came out, my cousin, who is a Ranger, he's now retired, 82nd Airborne, who never talks to me, called me up and said, you know what, I just want you to know, I just saw the news. He said, the U.S. Army doesn't know anything about riot control. The U.S. Army knows how to take care of business. So if you see somebody gives you an order, you do what they say. And a few years earlier, I'd been in Israel, and I'd seen armed army soldiers everywhere, and I thought, this will never happen in America. Well, there it was. And now here we are again. It's a different time. It's a time where there's a lot of fear. But just thinking about those 3 instances, which actually led Jamie and I to move back here, makes me grateful. Like the ancient Israelites, we've all had our own PTSD events. April was a stressful time for our business. We lost 40% of our business in one day. It was a tough time. We wondered if we were going to make it. And we're still going on. So if you're like me, you've had enough of hearing the thunder and the loud blast of the ram's horn and the flashes of lightning and the smoke billowing, and from the mountain we call COVID-19 and what people describe as the new normal. We know all things work together for good, and we know that God never allows us to be tested beyond what we can stand. But as this post-COVID-19 unknown situation and now the riots continue to drag on, how do we deal with it? People tell us to have a good attitude, and we do, for many, but still, it's a burden. So how do we get through? Well, Jamie and I have been relying on a lesson that we learned deeply during the Great Recession. We had a lot of major challenges back then, and we found a highly useful framework that has biblical roots. The framework relates to a Navy admiral who was the highest-ranking prisoner of war at the infamous Hanoi Hilton during Vietnam. Jim Collins, author of Good to Great and a well-known business analyst and writer, tells the story. I quote, "Tortured more than 20 times during his 8-year imprisonment, Admiral Jim Stockdale lived out the war without any prisoner's rights, no set release date, and no certainty as to whether he would even survive to see his family again. He shouldered the burden of command, doing everything he could to create conditions that would increase the number of prisoners who would survive unbroken, while fighting an internal war with North Vietnamese captors. He came up with his own code so they could communicate. He communicated with his wife, even though it might mean more torture. And at the end, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor after he was released. It's an amazing story." Collins asked Admiral Stockdale who made it and why, and who didn't make it and why. Surprisingly, Stockdale said the people who didn't make it were the optimists. Those were the people, Stockdale said, who said, "We're going to be out by Christmas." And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they say, "We'll be out by spring." And spring would come and spring would go. And then it would be Thanksgiving. So these people didn't have any credibility and they lost faith in themselves, which is the important point. Here's what we need to remember. As Admiral Stockdale told Jim Collins, quote, "This is a very important lesson. This is the important lesson for us today. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you could never afford to lose, with a discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." This has become known as the Stockdale paradox. You never give up, you never lose your faith that you will prevail in the end, but at the same time you accept where you are. And you will use your mental and spiritual discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your basic reality, whatever it is. This trial of the coronavirus, together with the dramatic economic societal upheaval it has brought, this will end. Even what's going on in Minnesota and anywhere else will end. Many of us are in the refiner's fire right now, and some of us may be going into the refiner's fire. But we have hope. In the Great Recession, Jamie and I found out that we had to deploy living trust. There were times when I was terrified. I didn't know whether we would stay in business. I thought we might even lose our house back then. But when we learned the Stockdale principle, we had found the framework. Winston Churchill, quoted him earlier, this is from a separate piece. He said, quote, "There's no worse mistake in public leadership than to hold out false hopes soon to be swept away," unquote. You have to realize that it's time to hunker down, but it's also time to have faith. The Stockdale principle annihilates false hope. It doesn't set dates. Like the book of James, it says, "Stay the course. Let patience have its full effect." Abraham Lincoln also said something that helped us then and helps us now. Lincoln, who was tormented during the Civil War, said, quote, "The great thing about the future is that it comes one day at a time." That's all we have to do, live one day at a time. As Jesus said in Matthew 6:34, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." Live one day at a time. At the same time, know and have confidence that you will prevail in the end. God has made an unbreakable promise to you. Let me review that. Today I draw much strength from the 40th chapter of Isaiah. The Stockdale principle reflects its truth. Let's turn there, Isaiah 40. And let's break into a thought with verse 28, reading out of the English Standard Version. Now, when I read this, I want to preface it with one thing. This is either true or it's not. God is either everything or God is nothing. So it's a binary solution set. So which are we going to pick? I'll pick the truth, that it is the truth, because it works. It goes on, beginning in verse 28. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable." We don't have to know everything all at once. "He gives power to the faint, and to him has no might he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. Here's the point. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. The key part in verse 31, those who wait. That Hebrew word wait, Strong's 6960 if you want to look out, can be translated trust or hope or anticipate. It means to eagerly anticipate. Hope is what Admiral Stockdale described in never losing faith that you'll prevail in the end, but at the same time being prepared to do what it takes in a day that Jesus described is anxious for itself. Today, I don't like sustained loud noises that reverberate through my heart and chest. I don't like lightning striking next to me, where the sudden compression of air affects every part of me and makes me flinch. I really, really hate earthquakes. And I don't like what the coronavirus is doing, especially in creating disharmony and setting people against each other. But I am prepared to wait. I am prepared to hope. I am prepared to wait eagerly and trust God that I and my wife Jamie and my son Winston and my family will prevail until the end. We will live one day at a time, and we will do what it takes to get through that day that we're living in. And that's enough. The book of Hebrews summed up the day the law was given in Hebrews chapter 12. It's a different day for us today. As we wrap up, let's take a quick look. I'll just read it to you. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no message be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. Indeed, in verse 21, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. No, that's not where we are today. We're in verse 22. We have come to Mount Zion in the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. This is what we have. This is our day. This is what we receive when we discipline ourselves with trust and hope, renewing our strength to know that we will prevail until the end, and that all will be well. Here's a final thought and a takeaway for you. It's where the title of our sermon comes from. Are you ready to soar? You might notice back in Isaiah 40 that those who trust, those who hope, those who wait for the Lord, they receive a special promise. Verse 31, it says, they who wait for the Lord shall mount up with wings like eagles. That's a simile. It's similar to Acts 2 where it says, blazing fire like, tongues of fire like something came. It means when the word like appears in the Bible, it means human language can't describe what's coming. It does not say wings of eagles. And as some translators and commentators point out, those who trust in God will receive wings themselves. Not wings of eagles, but they will be given metaphoric wings. They will have the capacity to fly above the challenges of a day, any day, to a new destination. What about you? The day is coming when your prevailing to the end will be rewarded. Wings are in your future. Are you ready to soar?